introverted and owned his inner beloved. That's the story that Mitch read. He read it and he evoked it, and then he briefly read from the analysis that I'm going to get into today, where he read the first two sections. So he wrote with a colleague, I think it was Mark Thompson, actually back in the day when they were still working together, this unprecedented gay-affirmative version of the Gilgamesh story, which is basically takes out from everything that's in the story in a gay-affirmative way, and is very, very loyal to that aspect of the story. And then he wrote this analysis, which is not published. In fact, it's a draft, so you might find that I'm reading it in a way because there's all kinds of notes that he wrote in the margin. It's hard to read. It's called The Romance of Gilgamesh, a Jungian commentary by Mitch Walker. He wrote it sometime in the mid-'80s, not exactly sure when he did. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 chapters with illustrations. And Mitch read the first 2 chapters last month, Love and Romance of Gilgamesh, where he basically analyzes the story from a Jungian gay-centered perspective, and you'll hear more about that when I read those sections. But he introduces to us the idea that if you have an understanding of the soul and an understanding of initiation, and you're gay-centered, and you put all of those together, the story comes back to life in a way that if you just read it on a page, it doesn't. And well, I'll get into it when I do a commentary, but he basically takes that part of Jung that has to do with what is the soul, and he shows how to reread that from a homosexual perspective in a way that makes a lot of sense. And then the next chapter is The Man Who Saw the Abyss, and he read from that. There's another chapter called World of the Gods, which is really interesting, but I'm not going to read it because it's too esoteric in a way, and we should move more quickly. But if I can remember, he talks about all of the different gods who organize the fate of the human beings, and like the Greek gods, who are very invested in the life of mortals on Earth. And this really should be. It's an analogous version of the Greek gods. They're Enlil and Enki and Ishtar and Shamash, who's this hot guy in a chariot. And when the sun comes out, he rides out in this chariot with the horses. It's really hot. So I'm going to read from chapter 4, called The Star from Heaven. All right. Paper broken. Okay. Each section is about 20 minutes. This section is called The Star from Heaven. His power without peer, there were none who dared to challenge him. That's Gilgamesh. So the depredations of the unfermented Gilgamesh finally raised the abused people's cries to heaven, where lived grandfather Anu, the final arbiter. Anu is one of those gods in heaven I was talking about. Since Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine, it is right that Anu should hear the complaint. He decides to send one of his stars, his soldiers, his angels, to Earth. This act is an example of what Jung called psychic compensation. Quote, just as the body reacts purposefully to injuries or infections or any abnormal conditions, so the psychic functions react to unnatural or dangerous disturbances with purposive defense mechanisms. End quote. Thus, quote, when the conscious attitude tends to exclusively in a direction that would threaten the vital needs of the individual, end quote, the unconscious produces a response, quote, with a strongly contrasting purposive content. And when a person's conscious attitude is unadapted, then the, quote, merely compensatory function of the unconscious becomes a guiding, prospective function, capable of leading the conscious attitude in a quite different reaction, which is much better than the previous one. I should just keep reading. read, but I thought I'd mention that whole idea that the unconscious produces a compensation is really important in Jung. It has this idea that in the unconscious is actually an intelligent libido, and that's a very different idea than Freud's. That the unconscious knows that the ego is one-sided and produces and forces a compensation. That's a really trippy idea. It's very Jung, not Freud. The problem, as we have seen, is the immaturity of the king, his infantile, impulsive, short-sighted expenditure of his creative powers and talent, his libido. He is all too crude and instinctual in his habits. It is most appropriate and just then that Anu's response should manifest as a, quote, wild man, as if that part of Gilgamesh had materialized itself autonomously outside of him, now to confront him face to face with his own unbridled narcissism. Quote, I am the greatest. That's Gilgamesh. That's Gilgamesh's narcissism. And Walker relates to that. I know I can. It's really gay narcissism, gay narcissistic violence. This falling star, the angel from heaven, will come to earth to redirect Gilgamesh, and in this way he will find and fulfill his true self. As Edward Edinger notes, quote, the notion that one's identity has an a priori existence is expressed in the ancient idea that each person has his own individual star, a kind of celestial counterpart, representing his cosmic dimension and destiny. The star of Bethlehem was Jesus' star, having a brightness commensurate with the greatest of his destiny, end quote. And he quotes Wordsworth, quote, the soul that rises with us, our life star, has had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar. End quote. Jung, in Symbols of Transformation, refers to the story of Buddha's mother, Maya, who, quote, dreamed that a star from heaven, splendid, six-rayed, in color rosy pearl, shot through the void, and shining into her, entered her womb upon the right. It's from Jung Collected Works 5. And also a poem by him. Quote, a star is falling out of the glittering sky, the star of love. Enkidu, then, is the, quote, celestial counterpart to Gilgamesh. Like Jesus, he also comes to redeem, to bring his, quote, cosmic dimension and identity. And he carries in his heart the image of his father, Anu, put there at the core of his physical being by Ururu. In a further parallel, Enkidu will later be sacrificed by the gods, and though descending to the netherworld, he will return in spiritual form to guide the king. I thought it was really interesting that Mitch collects all of these references about how we're born by a star. I think that he's trying to show that homosexuality has a star connected to it. So all individuality does. I think that's a really trippy idea, especially being attacked by the school which I teach by these postmodernists that say, well, gay identity is socially constructed, and this other idea that obviously Mitch feels and is feeling, and so does Jung feel when he's talking about something, is that we're born by a star. That's really, really, really important. The star gains a physical form in its fall to earth, becoming a man. Anu is very specific in his instructions to Ururu. Fashion a, quote, second image of Gilgamesh, may it be equal to the time of his heart, end quote. Anu's warrior is made to be a man particularly suited to Gilgamesh, his reflection made substantial and personified in a divine mirror, thereby expressing the will of the sky god. This is the meaning of the wild man, who reflects the animal in Gilgamesh. But Enkidu, the psychological double, is more than mere animal, for he is also equal to the time of his heart. The heart has generally been thought of as the seat of the soul, because experience of the soul is felt as love in the heart. The soul, quote, quickens your spiritual heart, opens your mouth and eyes to the real, end quote, said the Egyptians. Notes Jung, it is, quote, in the heart, end quote, that mystics find their own life force, which they call the sun. The Hindus would agree, as espoused by Ramakrishna, quote, the soul through which God sports is endowed with his special power. The landlord may reside in any part of his estate, but he is generally to be found in a particular drawing room. The devotee is God's drawing room. God loves to sport in the heart of his devotee. Thus Ramakrishna's advice, quote, "Can one ever bring God under control through wealth? He can only be tamed through love." End quote. The life of Gilgamesh lacks love, and the landlord in the house of his heart is silent. The landlord, the soul, is, quote, essentially the life of the body, the life breath, or a kind of life force, which assumes spatial and corporeal form. That's Jung. Quote, "the cold breath of the spirits," end quote, but also a vivid flame, quote, "the intangible living presence," end quote. The soul is the source of all the inspirations in life, in particular the inspiration of God. According to James Hillman, quote, "Other words long associated with the word soul amplify it further. Mind, spirit, heart, life, warmth, humanness, personality, individuality, intentionality, essence, innermost, purpose, emotion, quality, virtue, morality, sin, wisdom, death, God." End quote. The soul is the faculty within the psyche which feels the Spirit of God. And the spiritual seeker must awaken to and turn towards his soul in order to reach the divine land. It is through love that relationship to the soul is gained, and it is love that is the feeling of the sacred spirit, for love is, quote, "the mightiest force in the psyche," that's Jung, end quote. It is God himself. And that's the most important thing about Jung that Mitch is also amplifying, is that all this bullshit that we learn about religion, which is bullshit, denies the human experience, the phenomenology, the importance of romantic love as the purposive energy that guides us into the individuation process, into becoming our true selves. So Jung is really important because he values love as the soul, as the experience of the soul, and Mitch is amplifying that in the homosexual way. It is the story of Gilgamesh, the star of God that brings his true identity and destiny in clothed personal form, a figure of the soul twin through his descent from heaven. The idea of the heavenly soul twin was widespread in the ancient world and was systematically developed by the Egyptians in their doctrine of the Ka. When a man was created by the Maker, Khnum, they said, so was his soul twin, the Ka. Some of the light of God in heaven, the Ah, was formed into a center around which an ethereal body then developed called the Ba. The Ba had wings and then flew down from heaven carrying the Ah and entered the body of the mother. There the Ba served as a seat around which formed a spiritual body, the growing fetus co-equal to the physical one, and this spiritual body in turn was the Ka. From within the Ka, the light of God radiated forth, animating the body and mind of the gestating baby, embracing him in nurture and love. A man and his Ka were born together, and from the embrace of his Ka, he obtained his vitality and all his virtues and attributes. Although it existed in a man's body and grew in life as he did, the Ka, as a spiritual being also in reality lived in heaven, and a man was not normally conscious of his Ka. If he had led a virtuous life, he would be reunited with his soul in heaven, in paradise, after his death, or as elsewhere, through spiritual initiation. If the spiritual seeker retracing the path of the sun god Re descended to the underworld and passed through its 12 hours, he would reemerge and rise into heaven, reborn like the sun, united in perfect wholeness with his soul. In ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt can be found the historical beginnings of the heavenly divine romance with the masculine reflection soul. Later expressions of this idea can be found in the thought of Plato, as we saw earlier, and also in Gnosticism and Sufism. Gnosticism was a powerful spiritual movement of the first centuries AD in the Mediterranean world. An important Gnostic story called the Hymn of the Pearl tells of a youth who, through love, finds his, quote, robe of glory, end quote. important image. We'll talk about it some more. And as, quote, I now beheld the robe, it seemed to me suddenly to become a mirror image of myself, he says, end quote. This robe, quote, symbolizes the heavenly or eternal self of the person, his original idea, a kind of double or alter ego preserved in the upper world of heaven, end quote. In the Hymn of the Pearl, the, quote, encounter with the divided off aspect of himself, the recognition of it as his own image, and the reunion with it signify the real moment of his salvation, end quote. In Sufi thought, in turn, which developed in the Islamic tradition after 800 AD, there exists a person's divine angel, quote, the divine alter ego, end quote, from Corbin. Quote, his origin and his end, his eternal companion, in which his whole personal being is fulfilled, end quote, in the sacred temple of the heart.